So in the last video I recorded, we talked about processors and all those gates and more complex circuits. I said at the beginning of that video, that's the hardest part of understanding how a computer works. I'll admit I even struggle with it here and there a little bit because it's so fascinating and there's so much going on. And yet it's good to know the basics. This class is all about just learning the basics so you have some sort of frame of reference to grow into a computer science field. Today we're going to talk about memory, much easier. So if you'll remember, if you'll use your brain to remember, when we talked about history, one of the big things that allowed the computer revolution to happen is Charles Sanders Peirce realized that you could use on and off switches, light switches. You could use electrical circuits to emulate algebra, particularly Boolean algebra. So processors work by having switches on or off and playing around with the power getting through those switches. So when we went to make better terms of memory, better ways of doing memory, of actually storing information, which is one of the four things a computer does, we asked ourselves, what else in nature can emulate, can copy this on-off system? What can we get to actually copy on and off systems? So they created all kinds of things, and the memory field continues. But one of the ways they emulated an on-off system is simply by having a disk, what we now call a hard drive, and they put a ton of magnets on that disk, as much magnets as they could possibly force on that thing. And magnets are interesting. If you've ever played with a magnet, you know that there's a positive side and a negative side. And so how your hard drive works, how your ROM works, your read-only memory, we'll get to that in a little bit, works is by having all these magnets, and you have a laser that detects which magnets are flipped one way and which magnets are giving out a negative charge. But they're teeny tiny little magnets. And so that's how ROM works. That's one way ROM works. You have CDs back in DVDs, and now Blu-rays back from my day, right? Where we had CDs and DVDs. Now we just have digital entertainment online. But how CDs worked is they actually they used a laser to actually burn tiny little spots on a silicon disk, and then you had another laser that detected which spots had burn marks on them and which ones didn't. And if it didn't have a burn mark, that's a 0. If it did, that's a 1. We're going to talk about networking later on, but one of the other cool things that happens is they realize that phone signals can emulate on and off algebra. They can do that. And so we created modems, which was the early way that people got the internet. How that worked is by modulating tones. If the signal was loud, then your computer would say, oh, that's a 1. And if it's quiet, it's like, oh, that's a 0. And then they added more things to that. And so how to make memory, we just sort of looked around and said, okay, how can we emulate, how else can we copy Boolean algebra? Processors are a bunch of switches. They're either on or off, but what else in nature is either one way or another way? Magnets are either positive or negative. That's Boolean. That's binary. That's either or. So phone signals can be either or, which is really cool. Burn marks on a silicon disk, a CD, can be on or off. It can be burnt or not burnt. And we can actually design hardware to detect that and communicate that over to the processor so the processor knows the information. This is fascinating. And so that's what creates ROM. Now, the reason ROM is called ROM is it stands for read-only memory, meaning not that like there's other ways of doing memory, but ROM just means the data is sequentially organized. And so if I were to ask you what the 13th letter of the alphabet is, you'd have to use your fingers, right? You'd have to count to it. And so how ROM works is the computer actually has to go search through all the information till it gets to the information it's looking for. And how that looks is a CD has to spin or a DVD has to spin. The early hard hard drives had to spin. They actually had to spin to the information. This is why ROM is slower than RAM. If you're in my advanced class, that's going to be a quiz question. ROM is the total amount of information your computer has saved at one time, and it is slower to access than RAM because you have to count to it. It's like asking you for the 13th letter of the alphabet. You have to go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. M. It's M. So that's ROM. It's also called a hard drive. Now, with that said, we're living in 2020, and there's actually a bunch of hard drives that don't have to spin anymore, that aren't run by magnets. They're basically run by flip-flop circuits. They're processors unto themselves, but they've discovered ways to hold the charge even when there's no power to it. And so maybe now half of ROM hard drives are what are called static state drives. If you're in my beginning computer class doing the computer buying assignment, I'm going to ask you, does the computers you're looking at, are they solid state or a traditional hard drive? Solid state is SSD, traditional hard drive is HDD for hard drive disk or static state disk. That's how those count. So ROM is changing every single day, but the traditional ROMs is a magnetic disk, and depending on what way the magnets were focusing, that's how you built that. RAM, on the other hand, stands for random access memory. If I were to ask you what your name is, my guess is you wouldn't have to go July, June, April. Why am I doing girls' names with months? I don't even know. My guess is you wouldn't have to list off all the girls' names alphabetically until you got to your name, or all the guys' names if you're a guy, right? When you ask me my name, I don't have to go Kyle, no, Steve, no, Bob, no, Steven, no, not that one either. Andrew, no. Kevin, you have to. When I ask you your name, it's just there. So random access is a computer's short-term memory, and the computer can access that information randomly. It doesn't have to count to it. It just knows right where it is. It's there. It snaps it. However, calling RAM short-term memory is actually misleading because your short-term memory in your brain is not what's happening right now. Your short-term memory is what happened in the last 5 to 10 minutes, maybe up to a day, is how your brain works. A computer short-term memory, a computer's random access memory, is what is present on your computer screen right then and right there. And so any program you have open right now, that is now saved in RAM. So here's how RAM and ROM work together. Remember, RAM is a function of your processor. RAM is a processor unto itself, and it's flip-flop circuits. That's what it is. But how it works, at least in the traditional computer, how it worked, it's all cattywampus now with tablets and solid-state drives, but at least how it used to work is you had your hard drive, you had what was saved to your hard drive, and when you needed to open that file or open that computer, what your computer would do is it would grab that file, it would read to that file. Remember, read only has to read to the file. And then it would grab that program or that file, and it would transfer it over to your RAM, your processor, or one of your many processors you have in a computer. And it would load it into the RAM, and that is what would enable your screen to open that file. And so if I opened the file of this week's lecture, what it does is it goes to my ROM, goes to my hard drive disk, it reads it off the hard drive disk, copies it over to RAM, and then as long as it's open, it's saved to RAM. And then I'll let you guess what happens when I close the program. Did you guess what happens when I close the program? It transfers it back to ROM. It uploads it back over to the ROM and copies over, particularly if I've made any changes. If I click save, it saves that back to the ROM. So what happened in the old days, now it's all different, but in the old days, what happened if I had a paper open and I was typing out a paper and the power got cut and I was on a traditional computer that didn't have a battery, it would go down. And if I hadn't saved it back to the hard drive, I lost that paper. Now there's all kinds of protections for that. But back in the day, it was in my RAM, but the minute power was cut to RAM, you lose RAM. You just lose the whole thing. And so when you click save, it transfers it back over to the ROM and you're good. And so that's a little bit about RAM and ROM and how they work together to produce what you see on your screen. Just told you this to be a little bit shorter and a little bit easier video than the last one. We only have a few more, so stay tuned.